Welcome to the Art of Procurement podcast. I'm Philip Eidson, a 20-year procurement practitioner, former head of procurement, advisor to procurement leaders around the world, and the founder and managing director of Art of Procurement. My team and I work with our global network of subject matter experts to help companies elevate procurement's impact, whether that's through building and implementing transformation programs, sustainably reducing external expenses, or leveraging AOP Mastermind, our learning and development platform for companies of all sizes. You're listening to our flagship podcast, where we pull back the curtain and shine a light on the strategies, tactics, and tools that leading procurement teams are using to align their results with the needs of the business. Hi there, and welcome to this week's Art of Procurement podcast. And this week on the show, I'm going to share with you a recording of a recent AOP Live webinar that I hosted on the topic of supply chain resiliency with leaders from SourceDay and from NetSuite. Now, before we press play, I want to just let you know that this year, for the first time ever, I'm actually going to continue to share content on the podcast over the holiday period. So do keep checking back for your procurement fix over the next few weeks. Okay, well, with that being said, let's go straight into the podcast. When we think about supply chain resilience, there's a few topic areas as we go into the questions we're going to particularly focus on. We're going to think about, how to embrace automation to help us become more, or to help us build more resilient supply chains. We're going to talk about systemic inefficiencies and how, they're creating a lot of waste and also some risk on the revenue side and what we can do to help address that. We're going to look at the organizational perception of this zero-sum game that I think a lot of us are always involved in between growth and cost savings, and how it doesn't have to be that you can only have one versus the other. And we're going to look at, from a spend management perspective, how can we be more responsive to a lot of the changes that are frankly going to be inevitable in supply and demand signals when we're in this period of time where I think a lot of us don't really know what the next month or two is going to bring, never mind 6 months or 12 months out. So that's really going to be the flow of the conversation. Now, before we get into the questions themselves, I do want to introduce today's guests. First of all, we have Tom Kieley. Tom is the co-founder of SourceDay and started SourceDay back in 2013, really to change how manufacturers, distributors, and retailers collaborate with suppliers. And we're joined by Go Kamiyama, and Go is Senior Manager of Strategic Initiatives at NetSuite with 10 years of supply chain and procurement experience. And I'm not going to go deeply into your backgrounds because I'm actually going to ask the first question to give you the opportunity to talk a little bit more about that. And I'm going to start with you, Go. If you could share a little bit more from to give the audience a little bit of context around really how you were involved in supply chain and what your role at NetSuite is.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you, Phil, and thank you for Art of Procurement as well as Tom for hosting this webinar. So like Phil mentioned, my name is Go Kamiyama. I am the Senior Manager of Strategic Initiatives and Go-to-Market at Oracle NetSuite. And what that means is that I currently have overall vertical leadership responsibility for the health, beauty, and wellness segment of NetSuite Oracle, where I'm, from a day-to-day perspective, I'm influencing our go-to-market, product strategy, product adoption, and customer success. And my background comes from more so from supply chain, ERP, order management, where prior to NetSuite, I worked at Accenture doing system implementations as well as business case development, process reengineering, optimizations for Fortune 100 and 500 organizations across a wide variety of industries such as consumer product goods, high tech, apparel, footwear, and accessories, and then currently for the past 5 years been focused on the health and beauty sector. So really looking forward to really discussing some of my experience throughout what I've been doing, but also kind of forward-looking as well, where our organization's going and where our focus is from a supply chain perspective, and provide some insight into what are the things that we should be thinking about based on some of the stuff that's been happening, especially with the pandemic and kind of the global economy and all the different things that impact our day-to-day business. So looking forward to it, really excited. And I'm happy to be here to be discussing all this with you, with Tom and Phil.
Thank you very much, Go. And I'm going to ask you the same question as well, Tom. If you could just share a little bit about your background as well, and then I can get asking the questions.
Yeah, no, thank you, Phil and Go. Appreciate your time and excited for the questions today. So Tom Kieley, CEO and co-founder of SourceDay. A bit about my background, 2 or 3 time entrepreneur, also background in supply chain, but more importantly, big passion for software, right? So my co-founder and I, Clint McCree, both with deep backgrounds in supply chain manufacturing, Clint having actually run a manufacturing company and experienced real world pains, what we've gone to create and accomplish with SourceDay for our customers and for the market, which is supplier collaboration, visibility, and performance, which is becoming ever more important in this highly disruptive and volatile post-COVID world that we live in today. So really excited about answering the questions today. I think the topics are incredible and very timely with some of the experiences and conversations we're having with customers and prospects.
And Tom, the first question that I have is actually, it's really more of a level setting. What does resilience actually mean to you today in the context of today's challenges?
Yeah, it means quite a lot of different things. A lot of people, I think it's buzzword bingo for a lot of organizations today. I think everyone says that they're delivering supply chain resilience no matter what they're doing. I think the reality is it's really being able to have the confidence to exceed your customers' commitments. It really means having the table stakes to deliver what you need for your organization. Like I said earlier, right? Changes with supply and demand are at an all-time high. Volatility is kind of the new norm, and change is really the only thing that's constant in manufacturing and distribution, health and beauty, brands, whatever it is that you're actually producing or procuring for your finished goods. Those that have resilience are thriving today. Those that planned ahead and put systems in place like NetSuite and SourceDay and others, right? We're well ahead of the game. And we saw in a pre-COVID world where there was anywhere from 40% and below in changes across purchase orders and demand from signals from suppliers and misses and exceptions and handling that was in a created downstream effect of missing your customers' expectations. We saw that climb as high as 60% and above. Every single PO line or demand signal was requiring a change or some amount of manual touch point that was happening in Excel and email and really just being missed, right? So not having something to manage that is going to be a constant, that is going to be a continuation for the norm is change, is going to mean that you're not going to be resilient and you're not going to have a reliable supply chain for the future.
No, and the challenge that you talked about being Excel, something that I can completely relate to. For some of the folks who are watching in today may not know some of my background, which actually started in the automotive industry in the direct procurement world. And we ran manufacturing facilities on Excel spreadsheets essentially, and so you're always being reactive rather than being proactive. And it was always a struggle, one, from a time sink, but two, you just couldn't be resilient because you're always waiting for something to happen before you could respond to it. So it's definitely a challenge. That's why one of the reasons I'm really interested in today's conversation, because it's something that I certainly empathize, because I lived with that for a number of different years. But Go, I want to ask the same question to you as well from a resilience perspective. What does that, when you think about resilience, what does that mean to you?
Yeah, absolutely. So, Tom definitely kind of covered, the planning aspect of it, and it's very in a similar vein. And, from my perspective and the way I kind of try to break it down is, for me, supply chain resiliency is really about the company's ability to prepare, recognize, and be able to recover from disruptions that can happen within your supplier network. Obviously, very easily said than done. And there's a lot of things you can think about. And I think the number one thing is just Planning, right? So building a contingency plan. Nothing's always going to work. I think we recognize that. That's the reality of it. And obviously with pandemic, it was extremely difficult, but it's always be important to kind of be thinking about what's your contingency plan and not just do it, build it out once, but also dynamically changing that as your economic and geopolitical factors changes, and then making sure that it's ever changing and thinking about how that's going to apply to your organization is my kind of idea of being resilient. And, there are a number of different things that you can do. And this is really going to be depending on the maturity of organization. So like Tom mentioned, if you're on Excel based and you're completely manual communication, phone communication, going back and forth via email, getting out of that is definitely one of the biggest things to really achieve more planning and resiliency from a system perspective and visibility. But I think some of the other things that I've learned, and for me, we work with a lot of customers that have been very resilient, and I had the opportunity to talk to a lot of them and learn from what they've been doing. And a couple of things that I learned from them is, number one, your sourcing relationship is extremely important, right? Your suppliers are going to be getting your inventory to you, and at the end of the day, making sure your customer gets that, right? And ensuring that you are partnering with your suppliers to understand, maybe the suppliers are experiencing some demand signals or issues from a disruption perspective. And also defining, who your reliable suppliers are, because you're probably going to have your best suppliers, but also you'll have some of them that are going to be, sometimes late, or you want to be kind of measuring that. And having those backups with your suppliers is something important, especially for different geographies, because, right now with China, with the trade war, a lot of companies are shifting. So they're looking at other Asian countries as well as, places like Africa. So kind of thinking about how that's going to affect your supply chain is important. And that kind of ties back to some, my second point is around redundancy, right? So making sure your supplier network, there's some redundancy around it. And some of the other customers that I've worked with that they kind of look at redundancy is where some of these companies will be working with second tier, third tier, fourth tier supply chain network, where they're buying raw materials and basically providing it into a specific contract manufacturer to bring things together. So having visibility into that and making sure there's redundancy, if they do foresee a disruption, making sure that your second tier has additional inventory. So those are some of the things that I've seen. And lastly, and this is something that is really important if you have a system and if you have a single view, is around the demand signals, right? Demand planning, making sure that you have the right amount of inventory at the right place at the right time. Again, a lot easier said than done. But by having a view into your specific SKUs, how things are selling through is going to show you what your demand signal is up front from a customer perspective, and kind of backing into looking at your supplier network. How do you create those redundancy? How do you create those backup plans and contingency plans to make sure that you can, work with your disruptions? And I kind of feel like, those are a couple pointers, but those have been one of the bigger aspects of what our customers have been doing to be really resilient within this industry. And a lot of it is kind of looking at it a macro view, right? There's no one specific answer to it, to what Tom said. There's many different things. And being able to understand it overall at a macro view and then kind of dissecting into different pieces is something that really will allow a lot of these organizations to be resilient in this type of environment.
Yeah, one of the things that you said about the continuity plan, I think, is really important. And sometimes it's something that certainly I speak from a procurement perspective, we miss. And we talk a lot about the idea of a category continuity plan. So, we're used to in procurement talking about supplier business continuity plans. But when you look at it on a more holistic basis, it goes beyond an individual supplier, but more to the entire type of product or sub-product category that you're buying. Really looking at your contingency plans from that level, because then that enables you to take much more of a holistic look, but also to figure out where the actual pain points that you need to be more proactively managing are, because it's something I say all the time, you can't manage all the risks all the time. So you got to figure out where you can actually be most effective in putting those plans in place. Now, Tom, I want to start. I have a question from Clayton. And the question is, and this is really when we're talking about some specific supply chain related challenges, the question is that the impacts of COVID-19 have caused us to question many of the global contracts that we have in place and suppliers. Do you think the challenges we face today is going to cause supply chains to shorten, or the number of suppliers that we partner with to shrink?
Yeah, that's a great question, Clayton. I think from speaking with our customers and our prospects and other industry leaders and analysts and people like Go and yourself, right? It's clear that it's unrealistic to think that things in the supply chain are ever going to get any simpler. Despite the crisis and things going on. In fact, we're seeing quite the opposite. I think our customers are looking to guarantee and ensure they have multi-sourced suppliers for every part, right? Even commodities B, C, and D parts, right? Things that they normally would have very reliable suppliers for. I think you can no longer rely on reliability with without having multi-sourced suppliers in place. So, we're seeing things like VMI become more front and center, even with mid-market and smaller organizations, whereas before you'd see that, because of technology costs, previously, you'd see that with just enterprises and homegrown solutions. Now that's more readily available. You're also just going to, really start to see organizations like Go mentioned, right, lean in on having suppliers across different geographies and different regions to mitigate the risks of having a single sourced part come from a single region, as we saw with COVID, in China and other regions that, completely had stockouts for 3 to 6 months because they couldn't produce. So those types of risks are, now reality, and we've all experienced it. And I think, there are solutions and conversations to be had around becoming more resilient, building more reliable supply chain, and guaranteeing your suppliers are set up for success with real-time data and visibility into your demand.
Mm-hmm. Go, do you have any thought? I think I saw you nodding as Tom was sharing his answer. I wonder if you had anything to add to that.
Yeah, I mean, I think I echo Tom's statements, right? I mean, obviously, it's when you have one source for any of your products, and if that goes down, you are really at a stalemate, right? You're going to have to start from scratch. So kind of to my earlier point, making sure that there are redundancy or you have additional suppliers that are going to be lined up. And I think the biggest focus is just around geography, right? Because I've heard a lot of folks say China plus one. So what they were mentioning was they've only had China to provide a lot of their materials initially, and then they realized, oh my God, like based on what's going on, like we probably should start sourcing other places, just from a cost factor, but you just never know what's going to happen in the next day, in the next year, and just making sure you're going to be nimble and flexible. So that kind of has been definitely a large focus of a lot of the customers I've worked with. And also, thinking about it from a regional strategy as well, right? So not just focused on one continent, but places like Central America and South America start building out their manufacturing capabilities a lot more. And, to kind of answer the question, like on the short term, we probably will see a shortening of the suppliers just because they don't have the ability to supply. But on the long term, we're going to start seeing the supplier network expanding across many geographies. And I think the difficulty around that is obviously international tax laws, import duty costs. There's a lot more to it that we need to be thinking about. But the more you can get ahead of it and start working with these suppliers and making sure your organization is ready, that's how you're going to build some of the resiliencies around there. And the last component to be focused on is it depends on your industry, right? Because depending on industry, certain countries will have better infrastructures than others. China is an example. They do extremely well in high tech, right? So a lot of companies are going to be buying their electronics and their circuit boards that has been predominantly produced in China. So make sure you understand, what are some of the raw materials, components, finished goods that you're creating, and where are the major sources? And you'll start to see a trend and start focusing in that area. And I think long term, kind of going back to the question, I think a lot of that is going to expand, and you're going to have a lot of choices that you can choose from, which is going to be great from our perspective and also from, all over the world with manufacturers trying to supply it all over the place. So it should be very interesting to see how this is going to start playing out.
Yeah, and I have a follow-up. Sorry, go ahead, Tom.
Sorry, but Go had said something there. I apologize for interrupting, but electronics, is a perfect example. Our marketing team had to pivot overnight with marketing strategy, and we were able to go speak with a lot of customers and hear a lot of great stories through COVID that despite the tragedy. And one of them was a fast-growing private equity-backed electronics component manufacturer that is global. The majority of their suppliers being based in China. And through the pandemic, and because they were set up with resiliency and supply reliability and performance and visibility tools, they were able to maintain a 96% on-time delivery to their customers through COVID, which was above average for them, and really just kept them above par with their competition and kept them performing at the levels they needed to be at. And they ultimately really didn't feel much impact because they were already set up for success and they had planned well ahead. So it's a truly wonderful story of an organization that's fast growing, that is continuing to grow by acquisition with their suppliers based almost solely in China, that was able to thrive through COVID.
Yeah, and it feels like that was the initial kind of knee-jerk reaction of, oh, our supply chains are going to change. We're going to have to bring our supply chains closer. And, the reality is that the manufacturing bases for so many of the components that most organizations buy are so embedded in their geographic region that, one, it's an impossibility for that to change overnight, and two, is there really the investment dollars to make that happen? I see more of a focus on, ironically given the topic, and that's not really where I'm going this way, but it's really on the supply chain. It's like, how can we secure the supply chain? Because you're not going to change where everything's manufactured overnight. But there was a follow-up question that, Tom, I'll ask you first, then I'll come to you, Go, because it's based on something that both of you said. Go, you talked about redundancy in the supply chain. And Tom, you talked about seeing multi-sourcing. When you think about that, when you think about bringing different suppliers on, having backup suppliers, perhaps tooling up providers that you're not really going to get much volume for, but so you have a plan B, that all costs money. What are you hearing from an investment perspective, that companies are actually willing now to make that investment in risk, or is it still a kind of a tough trade-off for them?
I think it's always a trade-off, and that's a great question, right? But the trade-offs in theory, right? A lot of them were burned and learned lessons the hard way, and the risks, are going to outweigh the trade-off, right? Being prepared and maybe putting that upfront investment in tooling and sourcing and putting additional suppliers, especially for strategic parts, right? The ones that can really stop you dead in your track, and having a sole sourced. Mm-hmm. Correct. Those are the ones that really hurt organizations. We had a customer on the West Coast that was impacted pretty heavily through that exact experience, and had to shut down for many months due to that, right? And I think not being prepared for that held them back, and missing customer commitments, and opened doors for competitors that may have been more prepared. So those types of scenarios of is it worth the upfront cost and investment? That's a case-by-case basis, depending on your industry and your vertical and your competition. But I think more than anything, you're going to realize that as long as you put the investment, in the right place to solve, the 20% of the problems that are going to do 80% of the result, it's going to give you the biggest impact.
And Go, to come over to you, what are you hearing from folks that you work with as they're kind of making that decision?
Yeah, and I think it's twofold, right? One is a lot of it could be reactive. So what Tom's customer was saying, like, well, we basically realized that we only had one supplier, or we were going to get completely cut off. So now we need to start thinking about it. So that's more of a knee-jerk reaction that you really need to recover immediately. The other folks that I've seen is really understanding that, because their demand has increased, right? So whether they just sign with the Target or Whole Foods and you just get a massive order, recognizing that maybe one supplier is not enough. We probably need some kind of backup. And then we also need better data on those suppliers, because typically if you are a smaller company, you're going to take the first contract manufacturer or any manufacturer that are out there that are going to accommodate your orders, mm-hmm. right? Just because you don't have much order, you don't have much volume, you don't have much cash flow. So you kind of take that. And then as your business is going along, you really need to kind of relook at, all right, well, how am I doing with the supplier? How am I measuring them, right? And then how am I actually measuring whether I'm not going to miss my delivery date with my demand, with my customers? And that's where kind of a system comes into play, where you need some system that's going to be able to capture all that information, not just Post-it notes all over all over your office or within Excel sheets. You really need a singular system, or if not, complementary system that's going to allow you to provide that visibility. So from a retailing perspective, that's something that people start looking at to make sure that they can meet their demand with their supplies, and then also utilizing that data to understand, all right, we probably need to add some redundancy. So who do we start looking at? Start adding that to your vendor list. Start working with them a little bit to understand what your lead time is, quality is, so that then you're prepared for a rainy day scenario. So again, like it's twofold, right? Reaction, knee jerk, you learn from it, and then you kind of go for it. And then a lot of companies came from companies like that to say, hey, we need to get this set up. Let's make that investment up front. Yes, it is expensive, but we know that the upside is going to be able to help us and really get us through some of these disruptions. And that's something that we've seen with a couple of our customers that invested actually early on in NetSuite, recognizing that problem, and they actually were able to do well and exceed within the current climate.
Yeah, I think at least that now there is the openness to have the conversation about what the investment looks like. In the past, it would be one of those things that I would feel as a procurement professional, you may be trying to convince others to invest in risk management, but there's always some other place for the dollars to go. So at least now having to have that conversation and having data around why it's important and which parts of your supply chain to make that investment means that we can make better decisions. Now, I have actually a couple of system questions because you started to kind of talk about systems there, Go, but I want to actually hand over to Kieley because I think Kelly's got a question or two that came in from the audience.
I do actually, yes. I have a couple here, and I think, Tom, if I can start with you on this first question, and then we'll go to Go for some additional comments. James asks, what do you see as the key elements in a supply continuity plan versus the elements that you would have in a risk management plan?
Interesting. Yeah, that's a great question, James. Supply continuity and risk management. I kind of would put a lot of overlap in those. If supply continuity is going to be something that you're going to have to put strategically in place with systems and processes and strategic focus from your procurement team and your sourcing teams. And if that's one team, you need to give them the systems and tools and processes to be able to focus on that and make sure that is a strategic collaborative effort across the organization. And I think that will ultimately net the ability to have supply continuity. And then with supplier risk, that to us means a lot of different things. At SourceDay, we look at supply risk differently than you would typically think about supply chain risk or supplier risk in terms of the health or regional location or industry. Those are the typical risk scenarios that you get from some great platforms that you see out in the industry. The way SourceDay and our customers, are starting to look at risk more proactively is, their impact on operational risk and actionable risk. What does their suppliers' behavior mean to them in terms of supply chain continuity, right? If I don't have suppliers that are putting my needs first and being proactive with our highly volatile and disruptive changes to demand and scheduling with real-time visibility, then you really can't hold your suppliers accountable to the level that you need to really truly grade them on their real risk, right? How is a supplier truly impacting your business? What we see too often is customers are holding their suppliers accountable to lead times that are stale and purchase orders that after weeks of being shipped to them in their PDF format have already gone stale through expedites and change orders and move-ins and move-outs and cancellations that the supplier was never made aware of or visible to. You can't hold your suppliers accountable to those purchase order changes and those demand changes and demand signals if you don't give them the ability to be held accountable to it. So you're now injecting supplier risk that we look at differently, which is, how are they able to meet your on time and full for your customer deliveries and ensuring that you're meeting your customers' commitments without having to compensate by overbuying and safety stock and overspending in inventory and really hitting your top and bottom line of your revenue. So there's, I think a lot of overlap with, supplier continuity and supply chain risk that you really can accomplish both if you put the right tooling and processes in place by enabling your sourcing procurement team to be more strategic on those matters.
So is there anything that you wanted to add to Tom's response?
Yeah, I think I'm in the same kind of camp with Tom. I think supplier continuity and risk management definitely complement each other, or at least work with each other, right? So from a continuity standpoint, I think the way I typically look at it is, if my suppliers can't provide me with X, what do I do? What's my continuity plan? And it's similar idea with business continuity plan. If your plan A fails, what do you do with plan B? So obviously having additional suppliers to make sure you can back that up. And also, maybe also thinking about, the redundancy around first tier, second tier to understand how much inventory those suppliers have. So having a system like Tom, what SourceDay has visibility into what the vendors are doing. So you can have the ability to have the kind of the pivot function of going from left to right. So I think from a continuity perspective, just kind of thinking about if your first supplier goes down, what can we do next? And then the risk management aspect of it, I think kind of ties back to that is, number one, geopolitical aspect, right? You never know what's going to happen. Your supplier's country might go down, or you might have issues around shipment, transportation, import duty. So assessing that on a daily basis where, keeping a pulse on the business and the world is really important from a supply chain perspective, because the reality is supply chain is global, right? So having an eye on that and providing, getting more of a macro view to have the ability to do some risk management is important. And then also, looking at your business as a whole, right? From an organizational perspective, from top to bottom, from cutting a PO or even doing a planning all the way to getting the inventory to your customer, make sure you understand the process kind of front to end, so that if you do find some risk, you can mitigate that. And that's part of risk management, right? It is important to evaluate your own business, where things are failing, where things might not be failing, just so that you know what those risk areas are. And you can either proactively look at it to make sure that adds on to your continuity plan, or that it's coming, so it's not going to be a complete surprise. So you have some kind of backup plan going into it. And that's something that's really important to think about as far as kind of a business going and disruption happening. So that's something that's kind of where I kind of resonate with Tom as far as being prepared, making sure you have the visibility into it, and that's something that'll help you kind of along the way.
It's interesting. Oh, go ahead, Tom.
Sorry, Kelly, I apologize. No, I'll say quickly, Go, you said it great when you said that, the being proactive, right? What we're seeing often with talking to our prospects and customers and industry leaders, right, is they're still so reactive in continuity and managing risk with their supply chain. And it's really just a lack of process and innovation and driving change through the organization. I think change is one of the hardest things to put in place, especially if you've been doing business well for 30 years. And now, with more competitive forces and you have tariffs and all the uncertainties and disruptions in the world today, you really need to be proactive to put the innovation and process and change in place, and then really hold your internal teams and your suppliers accountable to those changes and those behaviors that can eliminate the risk and build continuity. And really, again, it's all about making sure you're hitting your customers' commitments, because if you're not prepared and set up to do that, your competitors will be.
So Tom, let me kind of keep you in the hot seat then. And I think, as Phil mentioned, our intent next is to move on to the next topic, which looks at automation. This question from Gareth, I think, is an interesting bridge from the idea of whether it happens to be business continuity or supply chain risk management over to automation, because he's asking a question about connectivity. So what he's saying is that connectivity is now critical for business success and resilience. Where do each of you see big gaps and challenges for connecting both with internal and external environments? So Tom, if you want to take that up first.
Yeah, that's a great question. I think for a long time, organizations have been heavily focused on the customer-facing or sales-facing side of their businesses, investing in e-commerce platforms and all of the things that help, drive sales faster, right? That are going to help the top of the funnel, and really neglecting, the back end of the house, which is where the rubber meets the road, right? You can get all the sales orders in the world, but if your suppliers don't have visibility to that with good lead times and accountability and processes and procedures, if they don't have the connectivity to your point of the question, right, then you truly cannot meet your customers' expectations, and you can't exceed and hit their targets and their sales orders, right? So all of that upfront investment was great. Now you've made that, and now you're getting, that growth and acceleration through that connectivity, but you've got to solve the other half of the story, right? So I'm a firm believer in connectivity, and I think there's a lot of ways to embrace that. There's cloud solutions, obviously. NetSuite and my biased opinion, SourceDay, make a great fully integrated and connected supply chain to hold your suppliers accountable, right? NetSuite and like all other ERPs, right? They do a great job of telling you the demand and the scheduling and the planning to meet your customers' commitments, and really to do it, at the leanest way possible, right? Without overbuying and without having, too little inventory. The problem is, that lives in a silo inside your four walls. And without giving that connectivity to the suppliers and to your supply chain and giving them real-time visibility to those demand signals and to that change, move-ins and move-outs and expedites, if they don't have visibility to that, then you're going to miss almost every time, right? You're going to rely on Excel sheets and manual processes and unfortunately, human error, right? Where you're just literally chasing suppliers down for every single part to hit your customers' orders. So having connectivity, whether through its, cloud-based technologies and portals, and in addition to EDI where that's available, where you can actually give your suppliers the ability to have connectivity that gives them automation, that gives them prescriptive workflows, that enables them to perform, to meet your customers' commitments at the highest level. Customers that didn't have that or weren't able to address that, living in, on-premise solutions and, very old legacy technologies that's hard to integrate with, hard to connect with, it is going to be, a long-term road for disaster, right? It's going to, be a critical failure point until you can create that connected world on the back of your house with your suppliers. You're not going to be able to have confidence in hitting your customers' commitments.
Interesting. Go, did you want to share your perspective on, connectivity either? I mean, there's lots of different ways to look at connectivity, right? So it's either different ways to look at connectivity and what it enables, or specifically related to the question of automation.
Yeah, absolutely. I'm going to kind of tackle it both ways. I'm going to talk from an automation perspective, but also connectivity within your organization. So I completely agree with all of what Tom said, right? Having connectivity as far as the customer's order all the way to the procurement side is really important, because that's where, your sales and forecasting and demand planning comes into play. And at the end of the day, the most important thing is having the right amount of inventory at the right time in the right place to make sure that your customer gets it. The forgotten part about this, and working with an ERP company, and I think all my financial brethren will probably appreciate out here, is the financial aspect of it, right? So it's all in good when we're buying and selling, but at the end of the day, when you think about a company, understanding your profit and your margin and what your costs are and what your selling prices are extremely important. And this is something that gets forgotten a lot, because, when the sales are good, and you think you're doing really well. But when when you look under the hood, you need to understand, all right, well, how much am I actually paying for my goods? How much am I paying for transportation? How much am I import, duty, and taxes that go along with it that really chips away at your margin, right? And you need to make sure you have a really good visual of that and understanding of that. And that's something an automated fashion can come from an ERP, because everything's connected together. And somebody that's within your finance and accounting organization can tell you, so that, the next time you go buy from a vendor and you thought that you got a really great discount on these items, and at the end of the day, you only chipped away 0.5 percentage on a margin, they can let you know about that. So you can have that, keep it in mind as far as strategically thinking, working as suppliers, negotiation, so that you can really increase that margin. So those are kind of important parts about it. And, at the end of the day, majority of the times, finance and accounting always comes at the end, right? Month end, you figure it out and you're like, all right, bam, it's on the spreadsheet of what our profit margin is at an organizational level. But when you have something like an ERP, you can really get down to the SKU by SKU level, understand what the cost factor is with one, supplier A versus supplier B, or country A versus country B, where you're getting it from, to make sure that you have a cost structure that's going to be behind it. And then the finance and accounting folks can tell you on a real-time basis how you're doing, right? So now you can start planning ahead, going back to the proactive aspect of it. And then this is where I'll kind of tie it back to you, Tom, around supplier relationship management. So now you can have that communication back and forth to have an accurate view of how things are, where they're, where they're at from a production standpoint. Do we need to air freight it versus ship it, which is a huge cost difference? And that communication automation can happen either having a supplier relationship management, or traditionally people do use EDI, or they have their own vendor portal to work with, or, if you're fancy enough and you have figured it out, blockchain is something that's coming along into the conversation as well. So a lot of different things that you can be using. But for me, just because I work with a lot of CFOs and everything's about cash flow and bottom line, understanding that number understanding where your cash flow is going to be in the next, 2 to 3 months is important for your next inventory. So that's something that you really want to think about from a connectivity standpoint, so that you're looking at it holistically as a company. You can be more proactive with every organization.
I'll jump in real quickly again, right? You made a really valid point, right? The data in the ERP is critical, right? The pricing data, the financial data around every part, all that needs to be accurate. And we have customers that are doing RFQ and sourcing for every component that they're buying for all of their build to order robotics and their finished goods, and that that requires a lot of data accuracy and ensuring that data is getting back into the ERP in real time, so that you can, as a financial department, have visibility to the true costing and to the true margins of your business. And then all that needs to tie back into invoicing and vouchering and accuracy and getting your suppliers paid in an appropriate time, and understanding your true liabilities ahead of time rather than as a surprise after the fact. So those are all critical components to ensuring that the data in your ERP is connected to your suppliers and to their expectations, and ensuring from a financing standpoint, where your profitability lies and really what your true liabilities are to your suppliers.
And Kieley, I want to thank you for those questions, and just remind anybody that's listening in, if you do have any questions to ask the panel, just pop them in that question box, and we'll see if we can jump back into questions one more time at least before we close out. But I wanted to just kind of continue the theme of you both talked about connectivity. And so I have one question that's more kind of beginner level, and then another question that may be a little bit more of an advanced level. And when I say beginner level, what I really mean is from a maturity perspective. So you obviously both come across a lot of organizations who, you just painted kind of the art of the possible. They're not there. That's why they come to talk to you to help them on that journey. As they're looking at the building blocks, and I'll ask this for you first, Tom, and then we'll come to Go for your perspective as well. When you look at when you're helping them put in place those first building blocks to get to a point where they have this connectivity, where do you even start? How do you kind of coach them on putting together that roadmap?
Yeah, I think it's a pretty straightforward answer, right? Is first start with eliminating all the manual processes that are going to create risk, right? And there's so much cloud technology out there today, with NetSuite and others that are easy to deploy, easy to train and onboard, and easy user interfaces, and really eliminating all of those manual instances of failure, and ensuring that you can drive collaboration and accountability throughout your entire supply chain to the entire organization. And I think it's interesting, to your point, we speak to a lot of organizations, customers and prospects and otherwise, and some of them are managing hundreds of millions, if not billions of dollars in procurement in spreadsheets. Yeah. They'll put in great ERP scheduling and planning engines, and then they'll pull all that data out and put it into a spreadsheet, and then they'll fire it off to their suppliers and then hope for the best, right? And then they just sit there at the dock and wait for stuff to show up. And don't make those big investments in technology that work so well and then throw it all back into an Excel sheet. You need to invest in a full end-to-end solution that's going to solve, again, 80% of your problems, right? Mm-hmm. And you can do that with collaborative platforms and SaaS cloud technologies that's going to drive prescriptive workflows and processes between your organization and at least your most strategic suppliers, the ones that are going to be the critical fault and the critical failure points. And then the rest you manage with a more of a white glove experience, right? And you do the old school methods of getting on the phone with them and managing their expectations and holding them accountable to your expectations. But adopting a piece of it, a continuity plan like an ERP is only going to get you half the way there, and you really need to have a full platform end to end with your trading partners, your suppliers globally, to really be successful and hold them accountable. And this just the disruption that we're seeing in the world, and the results that we're seeing from customers that were prepared are staggeringly different than the ones that are now struggling. And hopefully going to make it through this, but some of them unfortunately are not. They were not prepared, and I think so. Adopting technology now while you can, and build yourself ahead of time for resiliency and reliability with your supply chain, and ensuring yourself success and continuity into the future.
Thanks, Tom. And Go, any additional perspective you'd like to share?
Yeah, absolutely. I think, obviously start with the manual processes that you're doing, right? I mean, anything manual is going to introduce risk and inaccuracy, and overall, just looking at a macro and holistic level, it's going to definitely kind of keep you behind. So identifying those risks, the manual process here is probably your first step to your building block. And I see a couple different ways. So I see it where, people identify those, but they turn to point solutions, right? Whether it's commerce platforms or accounting platforms or just procurement platforms. So people do start there, and there's nothing wrong with that, right? If things are working, or if there's a specific budget that you have in mind and you can only invest in a pointed solution, that's great. But where you want to make sure you're thinking about is always kind of thinking ahead, right? In the future, if there's growth plans, or if you're adding more suppliers, or you're expecting issues and risk that's going to be coming along with that, now let's start thinking about what are the systems that can support you. So make sure there's a plan to it, and you don't need to do a whole big bang approach. You can take it step by step. And typically where we come into play from an ERP side is you have all these different pointed solutions for order management, inventory, warehouse, and it becomes we call it a hairball effect, where you're doing a lot of manual consolidations across the board. And that's where NetSuite can come into play to bring all that information into one place, where we're looking at financials, we're looking at inventory, order management, CRM. We have commerce, but we do also plug into commerce systems. So that's where we can create one source of the truth, as we call it. So you have one place to go in to see all your reporting. And then as you kind of going further, now think about all right, what else are my risks, right? What are my issues? And some supplier collaboration is an important thing. Why utilize a URP, pull it out in spreadsheet and send it to them, where you have the ability to kind of use a tool to make sure that collaboration goes in place. So there's a lot of kind of step-by-step process, and every business has a different maturity scale as far as how fast you're going to go up. So always kind of think about think about bite-sized pieces. What can you consume? What can you deal with immediately? Because these systems will also bog down your day-to-day processes, right? So there's going to be a short-term investment for a long-term gain, but you want to make sure you're not overwhelming yourself with a massive project. So make sure you can break it out, do a project plan. We consult on things like that, or even hire a consultant if you can, to kind of look at it holistically and create a roadmap for yourself. And don't stick to that roadmap. That will change, but make sure that becomes your guiding light, and then you can make adjustments, but at least you'll have a plan to kind of follow along. So that would be my recommendation, kind of think about as far as building blocks go.
Okay, no, thanks, Go. And I want to come back, Tom, to something that you said earlier. You were talking about demand signals, and this is where kind of you think about it from a more advanced perspective. We talked about getting the foundation blocks in place, but resilience is all about being proactive. We've talked about that kind of throughout the session. And you mentioned picking up and being responsive to demand signals as being something that is obviously beneficial to an organization as it looks to react to supply chain, to the things that are happening with their supply chain. The first question really on this is, what kind of demand signals should an organization really be looking at that help them adjust their forecast, their schedules, and do that proactively?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think it all really starts with first having a great MRP, or at least scheduling engine of sorts, right? Even if you're doing some of it manually yourselves, you really want to look at the data, right? It goes back to supplier performance and supplier risk. Too often we'll see on-time delivery rates from suppliers in the 30 to 60% range, and that's really kind of a misconception of your lead times are just inaccurate, or you're not really truly giving your suppliers the ability to be successful based off of when you're crediting them purchase orders and what your expectations of them are, and really having a collaborative relationship with your suppliers in a platform or otherwise that gives them the ability to have the tools and the visibility to be successful from the get-go. And so you really, from a demand planning and scheduling and forecasting standpoint, through COVID, some of the biggest, examples we saw were, we were able to see some customers save, 7 to 9 figures on, move outs and cancellations, meaning their signals from their customers changed so rapidly that, they needed to cancel and slow down delivery of specific goods. And had they not had technology in place through the scheduling engine, the exceptions of purchase order demand planning in place to give that visibility, even if it's manual, right? You need to get those move outs and cancellations and those critical paths that are going to impact your cash flows in the hands of your suppliers the minute that they exist. So, there's technology through MRPs and collaboration platforms that have enabled our customers and others to be able to recognize that 7 to 9 figure, in one case, really a 9-figure savings for their bottom line just through COVID by pushing out orders that they didn't need. And had they not been prepared with systems and processes to pick up those demand signals and digitally show them to their suppliers in real time to stop that shipment and to really delay that, once it's shipped, it's your liability, and now you're on the hook for it. And you can really pay for most of these solutions in 3 months or less, just by implementing them correctly and really holding your suppliers accountable to them.
And how much you talk about from a technology perspective and making the data, like having that visibility into data. How much is the collaborative side of your supplier relationship important in actually then being able to act on that information?
In my opinion, it's the most important, right? Without collaboration, right? A true collaboration. I'm not talking about, sending Excel back and forth or, in literally some cases, fax. We've had, large, billion-dollar organizations still sending faxes. True, real collaboration with workflows and visibility around actions and items and tasks that need to be done, really driving suppliers through those every single day so that they're just managing exceptions, right?
Yeah.
It's really about automating what is, good and happy in your scheduling and planning, and then collaborating and managing through prescriptive workflows and actions on what's not, what's going to miss, what's unhappy, and what is an exception that's going to cost either your top line, bottom line, or really a customer, right? You could eventually lose a customer through not having that collaboration. So, in my mind, collaboration is critical, and you won't succeed without having collaboration in place. That is, again, not just EDI signals and not just email and Excel. It's true workflow driven with actionable prescriptive actions to the suppliers that hold them accountable to success.
And I want to put out a final call for questions just as I come. Thank you, Tom. I want to come back to Go and just ask you, you talked about the fact that you're often talking to CFOs and with your finance hat on. How important is understanding kind of those demand signals and the changes within the supply chain? I mean, as a value add that a procurement or a supply chain organization can add and can bring to finance, how important is that?
Oh, I mean, it's a make or break, right? Because like to Tom's point, if we don't accurately predict, an order going away and you're on the hook for it, that is a massive amount of cash that is going to be just stuck on that inventory that you can't sell through. So just having the ability to put that bucket of cash to a reserve for something, for a different order is really important. And that's something that you really need a real-time system to make sure, your procurement ties in, when the purchase orders are coming in, when their bill is, and then understanding your AP aging, potentially your cash flow going in and going out is really going to be important to be able to kind of shift back and forth. And, tying that back to your demand planning as well as sales and forecasting tool will allow you to kind of make sure that those cash flows are going to be in the bucket, because if you don't have cash, you can't buy anything, right? And that's really the livelihood of a company. So it's extremely important downstream effect while it's at the end of it. But if we can get that as early as possible, right, from a finance standpoint, then your CFOs can allocate that budget in different ways to combat with some of these disruptions. So it's pretty critical to have something like that. It all starts off with supplier collaboration, right? And then making sure that all that conversation kind of goes downstream. Everybody's on the same page. You're not constantly slacking or, pinging people just to make sure they know about it. It's in one place, you look at it, and then, everyone can kind of go along with their day-to-day business without having to do additional work.
Yeah. Sorry, go ahead, Tom.
I'm sorry. He says such great things. I have to kind of pile on that, and not because I want to be the last voice heard. I promise. But Go, you hit it really well, right? I think that the collaboration is so critical today, right? You mentioned it that suppliers need to have real-time visibility to that data. The MRP and the scheduling engine is doing exactly what you bought it to do, and as long as you're feeding it good data back into the platform, and it can continue to get better. Lead times will continue to be more accurate, and your supplier collaboration will be what's driving that. And if you can't give them that, then the fact of 40% to upwards of 60+% of your PO lines that do require change are going to now be sitting in your ERP, your scheduling engine. You're going to be planning and tooling and staffing and doing all of that to meet customers' expectations on hopes, and then realizing that the 50% of your PO lines that you expected to come in are late, and you just weren't aware of it because it was in an Excel sheet buried on someone's desk. So that data collaboration and that accuracy back into your MRP and your scheduling and planning engine is absolutely critical. And going back to the point is you can't have that accuracy without collaboration, and it's got to be in real time.
Well, we have just one more question that came in that I'm going to put you on the spot because we've got a couple of minutes left. So it's going to be a quick fire minute answer for each one of you to the question. But it came in from Colby, who just asked for your perspective on the importance of adoption when it comes to new systems. And perhaps in your 1 minute, what are some of the keys to driving adoption of a new system? I'll go with you, Tom, first of all.
That is a wonderful question, and one of the things that I've seen in my software career, throughout in the last 20 years, has been adoption is generally poor, right? And it starts with accountability. Oftentimes, executives will lead from the ivory tower and buy solutions, and then just say, hey, here's a solution, you need to use it. That's a recipe for disaster, and that's a failure. So, in building SourceDay, my co-founder and executive team and I, have put in place a core component of our success and a key pillar to our customers' success, which is change management and really managed services that we offer as a part of our platform that drive the success of the platform. If we're delivering a solution, and if NetSuite is delivering a solution to you, that's not being managed and educated and trained and held accountable for that change and success of the investment, then it's going to fail before you even start. So because of those known factors of a new technology, which companies will often buy and put it in and become shelfware, we have made it a core tenet again as a part of SourceDay to guarantee supplier adoption through all of our customers, and guarantee customer and user and buyer adoption through training and self-service onboarding, best practices, continual education, change management. Just quick last story. I know I'm over my minute here. Is we just brought on a new chief customer officer who is building out our entire customer journey program for our entire organization. It's that critical to the success of our customers and our business that we have an entire team dedicated to the managed services and delivery of our platform and exceeding our customers' expectations. And that's not just our customers, but also their suppliers.
Yeah. Go, I'll hand over quick tips on customer adoption.
Yeah, I'll keep it quick because I agree with everything that Tom said, right? So I think probably 2 to 3 folds. Number one, at the organizational level, the leaders have to be on board with this, right? Top-down management is one of the most critical things where if you are a leader or if you have an executive sponsor, make sure that they are supporting you and providing the reason why the company is doing it. Because as long as the people understand why we're doing this, people can get behind it, and then it becomes more of a change management aspect. So that's my second point, right? Making sure that you have a great change management team that can help you and shepherd the team across the line from going from legacy technology into new technology. So that is a big shift. So making sure that there's things like subject matter expert within the team, training is being rolled out correctly, and efficiently. So change management is important. And the last component is what SourceDay has, and we do really well as well, is just make sure you select a vendor that has a good customer success program, right? Make sure that they have great support, because inevitably, you're going to have to, lean on your software vendors to understand certain things. You're going to have to need help from them to solve certain problems. So make sure you're choosing a vendor, and as you are selecting them, think about that to ensure that they're going to cover a lot of those concerns there.
Okay, perfect. Well, we're exactly at the top of the hour, so you just squeaked it in there, both Tom and Go. I want to close out yeah, by first of all thanking everybody for joining us. I really appreciate you being a part of the conversation and hitting us up with some questions as we went along, and for submitting all the questions that you submitted in advance as well. And then to Go and to Tom, I want to thank you for sharing your experience and perspective with our audience today. It's been a great conversation, and I can't wait to do it again soon.